I want to thank everyone for coming to this meeting of the Socratic Club. The Socratic Club has existed on the Gonzaga campus for about 18 years. I can hardly believe myself we've been going this long. But the club takes its inspiration and even model from the Oxford Socratic Club of the mid-1900s that was presided over by well-known Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis. The Socratic Club was started because Oxford was loaded with all different kinds of intellectual organizations and student organizations. But some students approached C.S. Lewis and said, we don't really have a place where we can gather together people with wildly varying ideas about religion and philosophy in particular, or religion broadly speaking. And so the name of the organization, the Oxford Socratic Club, was taken from a passage in Plato. You see versions of it several places, but one version is in Plato's Phaedo, the motto of following the argument wherever it leads. And so the club's idea was to, in an academic, philosophical, argumentative way, to address issues that bring together people of wildly different views, worldviews on religion and on Christianity in particular. And the Gonzaga Socratic Club follows that by bringing together people of very different views on questions like the nature of God, Christology, the problem of evil, religion and science, Christianity and popular culture, and so forth. But we've also, in the last year, we've been doing a series on human nature. Gonzaga, like many other Catholic institutions and many other Jesuit institutions in particular, teaches an intro to philosophy course that focuses on the philosophy of human nature. And so what we're doing is just exploring a variety of perspectives on human nature. We started last year in the fall semester by looking at some presentations on love in human nature, on dualism in human nature, on evolution in human nature, and we'll be continuing that. We have meetings coming up later this semester on philosophical anthropology and philosophical psychology, what they are, how they're different. We have one on hylomorphism, which is another broad outlook, a broad way of approaching the question of human nature. And then around Easter, I didn't plan it this way, but it just happened, we'll be talking about human nature, immortality, and resurrection. So I'll come back and mention those events and dates at the end of our meeting, but I want to introduce our speaker. We are excited to have a guest speaker from far away from the Chicago area. Professor Drew Dalton is professor of philosophy at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois, which is in the Chicago area, right outside the city limits. Dr. Dalton received his PhD from the University of Leuven in Belgium, and that's where my connection is, because he's friends with Tyler Tritton and Danielle Lane, who are colleagues in the philosophy department. Generally speaking, Dr. Dalton's research interests are in 19th century continental philosophy, 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, but he also identifies as a naturalist. And I was hunting for a naturalist, and actually, I can say that I actually searched far and wide for a naturalist here in the Spokane area, and Dr. Tritton said you might consider talking to Drew Dalton as someone who might represent a naturalist point of view. So I'm excited to have Dr. Dalton here, and his talk is going to be on excuse me, is going to be on speculative naturalism and the question of human nature, meaning, and value. So let's welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Drew Dalton. Thank you.
Thank you. Here's where I'll pause for the what would hopefully be applause and derisive laughter as I walk to the stage. Before I begin, I do want to thank Professor Calhoun and the Gonzaga Socratic Club for organizing tonight's talk, and Professor Tritton and Professors Lane for suggesting me against their better judgment to give this. And you'll notice that Professor Calhoun said that he searched high and low for a naturalist, and what he came up with was me. So that should tell you that he's scraping the bottom of the barrel a little bit. So if you're here under any sort of like compulsion by one of your professors, now's the time to bail, because what follows is just going to be terrible. I think, though, by way of introduction, I think before we could talk about what human nature may be, or indeed what anything is, I think we have to discuss how it is that we can come to know things in the first place. That is, I think we have to examine the methods and routes through which we claim to know the nature of reality. Only by passing through this first epistemological step, as philosophers call it, and clarifying how it's possible to know something at all, can we discuss what we know, and in this case, what we can know about the human. With that in mind, I've organized this evening's talk into roughly 4 completely unequal parts. First, I want to address this epistemological question. There, I'm going to trace briefly and in broad strokes what I think the history of the concept of knowledge in the Western world is. And I'm going to do this with the aim of showing how, why, and when philosophical naturalism, as one particular epistemological approach, emerges. Having done that, I want to define even more briefly what philosophical naturalism is and describe my particular position within philosophical naturalism. So I'll set up some basic definitions there. This will allow me, thirdly, and here's where I'm going to be disproportionately spend my time, I want to explore what I think philosophical naturalism says that we can know about the nature of reality, full stop. And from the nature of reality, what we can therefore deduce about the nature of humans. This will allow me to conclude briefly, fourthly, by trying to extract some meaning and value about the nature of the human in particular as an element of nature. Sound good? So before I can begin, though, by way of apologia, I want to say I didn't have much time to develop tonight's talk, and I didn't want to wing it and let you all down with what are my exceptionally poor powers of improvisation. So I decided to develop tonight's paper from a talk I recently gave at Professor Tritton's invitation to the Metaphysical Society of America. So if at times what I'm presenting tonight gets choppy, or I get lost in some details, or I go down some rabbit holes, I hope you'll forgive me and trust that I'll do my best to tie it all together towards the end, and I will. But failing that, if you're still bored out of your mind, I hope that you'll give me the chance to clarify what my position is in the Q&A to follow. Sounds good? All right. I'll take your silence as consent, though we know that that is a terrible, terrible thing to do. To begin with, then, it seems to me that there are roughly 4 different ways in which the acquisition of knowledge has been accounted for in the West. And here, in deference to the aforementioned Jesuit affiliation of Gonzaga, I have decided, against my best interest, to draw upon my high school Latin to name them for you. So, traditionally in the West, it seems to me that knowledge can be accounted for as achieved through either revelatio, which is to say received through direct or indirect revelation or transmission, either as intuition, inspiration, or apparition. Alternatively, knowledge can be achieved through lexio, that is through the inheritance and study of recorded wisdom and or cultural traditions, which can, in the words of St. Augustine, be taken and read. Thirdly, knowledge can be attained through the operation of ratio, that is through the rigorous and systematic exercise of our mental functions, for example, critical thinking and logical analysis. Finally, and fourthly, knowledge can be acquired through testimonio, whereby we come to know through direct observation, material witness, and or empirical examination. Now, traditionally, these 4 different accounts of how knowledge can be attained have not been seen as operating in opposition or independently of one another. To the contrary, for the bulk of the history of Western philosophy, it's largely assumed that in order to achieve a complete understanding of reality, one must weave each of these 4 epistemological strands together into a coherent tapestry. Hence, Augustine and/or Anselm's famous account of the pursuit of wisdom as fides quaeris intellectum, or faith-seeking understanding, which Augustine at least defines as the attempt to flesh out and inform the insights of revelatio and lexio by way of ratio and testimonio. Of course, there are exceptions to this norm in the history of Western philosophy, examples of those who've argued that in order to purify knowledge and distinguish what is real from what is merely illusory, one or two of these epistemological strands have to be cut. One particularly famous example of such an approach can be found in the philosophy of Parmenides and his student Zeno, who argued that ratio alone, or as they would have it in the Greek, logos, was the only proper guide to truth, or aletheia, and that every other route to knowledge, in particular direct witness of testimonial, or in Greek phenomena, led to false opinions or doxa. By the way, here, if you're interested in learning more about that or having me be demonstratively corrected, I would encourage you to take Professor Tritton's ancient philosophy class. Nevertheless, excuse me, not Professor Tritton, Professor Lane. It's because your name's up there, Tyler. All right, so Professor Lane, who was talking to a small child. By and large, however, attempts like those of Parmenides and Zeno to separate the various strands of knowledge from one another were exceptional in the history of Western philosophy. Exceptional, that is, up until around the 16th century, as you'll see momentarily. There is something to note, however, before we get there, about this apparent inclusivity of the various epistemological approaches within Western philosophy. Namely, that despite its apparent open-mindedness to every epistemological method that we listed, not all of the forms of knowledge which we accounted for were seen nor treated as equals. To the contrary, one or two were always privileged over and above the others and designated as the dominant guide or the ruling constraint. So, for example, in the classic Christian approach, exemplified in the epistemology of Augustine and Anselm, revelatio and lexio are given priority. Indeed, according to Augustine, only if the primary truths of revelation and tradition, which are accepted in faith, are used to measure the products of ratio and testimonio, can a full picture of reality be developed. If, he therefore concluded, some product of the latter appears to contradict or betray the claims of the former, then its content must either be rejected or reformulated until it fits squarely within the constraints of what is accepted and received through faith and tradition. Now, the problem with this epistemological privileging of revelation and tradition over and above the products of reason and or empirical examination is, at least in my view, that it inevitably leads to a number of fantastical absurdities. From, for example, the overly complicated account of the cosmos developed by Tycho Brahe to fit all that was held true and accepted by faith and tradition, to, I would argue, the dualistic model of the human, maintained by scholastic philosophers at the end of the late Middle Ages. So I think dualism is about as wacky as a geocentric model. I just said that to be, controversial. I don't actually feel all that strongly about it, but, hopefully that'll be fun. All right. Indeed, such absurdities piled up one on top of the other so thoroughly by the late Middle Ages that the composite portrait of reality maintained by the majority of philosophers in the West at that time was so filled with logical contradictions, epistemological incongruities, and empirical holes that it literally became unbelievable to the average person. Fortunately, at least by my accounting, there were a few individuals who were brave enough to voice this incredulity. Figures like Galileo and Descartes, who endeavored not only to unravel the tapestry of the late medieval worldview, but to separate out the various epistemological threads which were used to weave it together, all in the hopes of understanding reality in a new way. Indeed, the heart of this movement, popularly called the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution, though I have issues with both of those terms, was, in the words of Immanuel Kant, to dare to know in a new and different way. And this different way required prioritizing knowledge in a new order. It's from this attempt to re-examine the relation of the various forms of possible knowledge to one another that the topic of my lecture tonight, philosophical naturalism, is born. So, what's philosophical naturalism? Broadly defined, philosophical naturalism consists in any attempt which, in the spirit of the epistemological revolution of the so-called Enlightenment, seeks to overturn the late medieval supernaturalistic prioritization of revelatio and lexio over ratio and testimonio. It does this by restricting knowledge exclusively to that which can be achieved through the natural means of either rational deduction, empirical induction, or some combination thereof. In this regard, philosophical naturalism can be seen in many ways as an inversion of medieval epistemology, one which privileges ratio and or testimonio over and above the insights of revelatio or lexio. Note, however, that in this inversion, philosophical naturalism does not necessarily reject the claims of revelatio and lexio entirely, in the same way that the supernaturalism of medieval epistemologies did not reject the claims of ratio and testimonio. Instead, like the scholastics before them, I think philosophical naturalists simply insist that the claims of these forms of knowledge be tested against and measured in relation to what can be known via ratio or testimonio first. Only that which fails to fit within these constraints, they argue, must be discarded as superstition. So you can have supernatural claims as long as those supernatural claims can be grounded and extracted from natural ones through natural means. Hence, for example, Baruch Spinoza's willingness to accept the existence of the divine, so long as the divine is identified with the cumulative power of the natural world. Or alternatively, Immanuel Kant's willingness to admit the validity of religious beliefs and practices, so long as, in his words, it remains restricted within the bounds of reason alone. In this regard, I think philosophical naturalism is not defined so much by what it claims to be true as by how it suggests legitimate claims concerning the truth can be made. For the naturalist, the only legitimate claims are those which can be supported or emerge from the definitively natural means of either reason or science. That's what I think philosophical naturalism is broadly defined. More narrowly, I would define philosophical naturalism as the attempt to rationally explore, apply, and interpret that which has been discovered in and through the testimony of the natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, etc., in order to create a comprehensive, coherent, and consistent account of the nature of reality as a whole. Within this narrower definition of philosophical naturalism, there are, of course, any number of different thinkers and positions with, you might expect, the usual amount of debate and disagreement between them on everything from the role of the sciences in naturalism to the knowability of the universe as such, not to mention the nature of the human. But by and large, what holds them all together is the conviction that the best method to understand and know the nature of the universe and the human is through natural means. Now, so not tradition, not revelation, either the natural means of human knowing or the natural means of investigation. Now, my particular position within the broad array of possible naturalisms is what has become known somewhat controversially as speculative materialism. So what is speculative materialism? My particular position. Roughly speaking, speculative materialism consists in the claim that human beings are fundamentally constrained by the limits of their reason to know anything at all. Reason is the only access we have to reality. But it's possible that through a special operation of reason, we can speculatively extend what has been testified through the empirical sciences in order to make meaningful claims about the nature of the universe as it exists in itself. That is, outside the bounds of human reason. So though we're constrained by human reason can operate upon itself to speculatively extend the testimony of the sciences to talk about reality as it might exist in itself. In other words, what speculative materialism claims is that it's possible to know reality as it exists in and of itself through the rational extension of the testimony of the empirical sciences. So long, they say, as reason itself remains constrained by the material data of that testimony. In other words, so long as reason allows itself to be restricted by material testimony. What interests me in this approach to philosophical naturalism is not only what I take to be its epistemological strengths, but how I think it opens a door within philosophical naturalism to talk about elements of reality which are traditionally disregarded by naturalists as remnants of superstitions and supernaturalisms of the Middle Ages. Things, for example, like the possibility of moral absolutes, the existence of the divine, and the so-called meaning of life. So what I like about speculative materialism is that it's a naturalistic approach that revitalizes talk about things which are traditionally seen as outside the domain of philosophical naturalism. Make sense? All right. Now, given its interests and given its aims, you might consider biology, the field aimed at understanding and accounting for the order and structure of life, human life that's inclusive, to be the most natural ally to something like speculative materialism. if not philosophical naturalism in general. And indeed, the biological sciences are unquestionably of value to me and other philosophical naturalists. In fact, evolutionary biology is perhaps the most popular field of the contemporary material sciences within contemporary naturalism. The perfect example of this is Daniel Dennett, who's gone so far as to suggest that the biological sciences, and in particular neurobiology, could stand in as a perfect substitute for, could and should in many cases, stand in as a perfect substitute for many of the traditional subfields of philosophical inquiry, like the philosophy of mind, for example. And in fact, it's precisely for this reason that Dennett thinks that you can't say anything meaningful within philosophy about things like the existence of the divine or the possibility of human meaning making, because within biology, he thinks these things are extracted. Now, whether or not this is true, whether or not Dennett's particular take on philosophical naturalism is correct, I think there's a problem with the prioritization of the biological sciences within philosophical naturalism today. Namely, it seems to me that this emphasis on biology over, say, chemistry or physics grows from an unrecognized prejudice within philosophical naturalists. An unrecognized prejudice, which I think is actually the legacy of the supernaturalism of medieval epistemology. In fact, I think it grows from an unjustified or unjustifiable belief that there's something unusual and exceptional about the nature of living organisms, something which distinguishes them from other kinds of material entities and separates them in kind, not just degree, from other presumably more passive and inanimate material objects. Such a presumed exceptionalism is, I think, the legacy of the belief in some élan vital, or animating spirit, within biological organisms, which allegedly distinguishes them ontologically from every other kind of thing. In this regard, I think the privileging of the biological sciences within philosophical naturalism is a latent legacy of a kind of unrecognized dualism, which is the direct inheritance of these medieval epistemologies, in my take. Such a strange divorce within being is, of course, not exclusive to naturalists, however. To the contrary, even someone as eminent as the famous physicist Erwin Schrödinger admitted to believing that, quote, living matter, while not eluding the laws of physics as established up to date, is likely to involve other laws hitherto unknown, end quote. These laws, he suggests, likely free biological organisms from the exclusive role of determinate necessity, which governs the world of purely material objects. Like Schrödinger, I fear, many philosophical naturalists continue to think in this way today. And it's this unrecognized prejudice which I think inclines them towards the biological sciences over and above the other material sciences in order to understand human and philosophical questions. The problem, however, is that this dualistic division of reality into two distinct realms, organic and inorganic, has been entirely rejected by contemporary biologists themselves. Indeed, the consensus of nearly every contemporary biologist is that there is no real or meaningful distinction between organic and inorganic objects. As the historian of science Sean Carroll notes, at a fundamental level, there aren't separate living things and non-living things, things here on Earth and things up in the sky, matter and spirit. There is just the basic stuff of reality, appearing to us in many different forms, end quote. This basic fact, which is almost universally acknowledged amongst contemporary biologists, is summed up nicely by the contemporary biologist Nick Lane at the University College London, who writes that, quote, there is a continuum between non-living and living, and that it is pointless to try to draw a line across it, end quote. In point of fact, the preponderance of biological research conducted over the past 50 years, as is famously documented in Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan's classic What is Life, has been dedicated to precisely erasing this line by mapping this continuum and the commonalities which exist between organic and inorganic beings. To accomplish this task in that book by Margulis and Sagan, they go to great lengths to show precisely how organic life first emerges from inorganic matter, and to show that every law which governs the operation of biological entities is ultimately rooted in and derivable from more basic chemical laws, which govern the exchange of energy at the inorganic level. Drawing from and expanding the research of Margulis and Sagan, contemporary biochemist A.D. Pross has therefore concluded that, quote, there is no élan vital, which distinguishes organisms from non-living matter, end quote. To the contrary, Pross writes, quote, living things are made up of the same old dead molecules as non-living ones, end quote. As such, Pross concludes, if we were to understand the basic function and apparent telonomy of living organisms, we must move beyond biology and into the realm of chemistry. By Pross's account, at least, quote, through a newly defined area of chemistry termed by Gunther von Kiederowski systems chemistry, the existing chasm separating chemistry and biology can now be bridged, such that the central biological paradigm, Darwinism, is just the biological manifestation of a broader physiochemical description of natural forces, end quote. Therefore, as Nick Lane writes, from a theoretical point of view, life is no mystery and it doesn't contravene the laws of nature, as Schrodinger thought. Instead, as Prost shows and what areas of research like systems chemistry prove, is, quote, that Darwinian theory, that quintessential biological principle, can be incorporated into a more general chemical theory of evolution, one that encompasses both living and non-living systems alike, end quote. So we might justifiably conclude from this that while our pursuit of the naturalistic account of human nature should have some biological application and import, ultimately that account will not be original nor exclusive to the biological sciences. Instead, it will be primarily chemical, and therefore it is to chemistry we might think that we should turn if we are to understand the fundamental nature of reality and derive from that some account of the nature of the human. After all, as Francis Crick, the Nobel-winning biologist and famous eugenicist, racist, and sexist, wrote, a living cell is little more than a fairly complex and well-organized chemical factory. Great scientist, terrible human being, by the way, Francis Crick. Yeah. But we must remember that those laws which govern the biochemical exchange of energy and the structure of the nature of chemical processes which support them are not themselves original nor exclusive to the realm of chemistry. Instead, they originate within and obey a higher order of necessity, one which is pursued within the domain of physics. Hence, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman's conclusion that, quote, the deepest part of theoretical chemistry must end up in physics, end quote. Indeed, for precisely these reasons, contemporary biochemist Charles Cockle argues in his landmark piece, The Laws of Life, that, quote, life itself must be fashioned by the laws of physics, end quote. Or again, in the inimitable words of Richard Feynman, everything that living things do can and should be understood in terms of the jiggling and wiggling of atoms, end quote. Following this line of reasoning, the bulk of contemporary biochemists have turned in the last 30 years to physics in order to understand and account for the ground and nature of living reality. This turn within contemporary biochemistry to quantum mechanics in particular has even given birth to a new subdiscipline called quantum biology, which is currently the fastest growing field in microbiology. In a nutshell, quantum biology is the attempt to understand and document the underlying laws of physics which govern the biochemical exchanges which structure and define the nature of life, ours included. John Joe McFadden and Jim Al-Khalali, two of the pioneers of quantum biology, define the axiomatic principle of their field thusly. Life, they wrote, depends on quantum mechanics, end quote. From this perspective, biology appears to be nothing more than applied chemistry, which in turn is itself nothing more than a branch of applied physics, So it is to physics, I would argue, that we must ultimately turn if we want to pursue a truly informed scientific naturalism and develop from that potentially a comprehensive and justifiable account of not only reality, but human nature, meaning, and value. With that in mind, I hope you'll allow me to examine momentarily what contemporary physics tells us about the nature of our reality. And again, I promise I'll tie this all together in the end with some more concrete things about the human. Of course, it's been almost the singular aim of theoretical physics for the last 2 centuries to discover some grand unifying theory of existence, which could reconcile the conflict which appears to exist between the operation of matter at the macro level and its operation at the micro level. This pursuit is typified famously in the ongoing attempt to bridge the apparent divide, which seems to divorce the laws of general relativity, which govern the movement of relatively larger bodies with absolute predictability, from the apparently chaotic dynamism of quantum bodies at the subatomic level. And as is well known, despite the great progress which has been made towards advancing our knowledge of how matter operates on both levels, a grand unified theory still eludes physicists today, though some, like Brian Greene, would suggest otherwise. But I think most people disagree with his take of things, if you've ever read any Brian Greene, a popular physicist. At this point, however, there remains no immediate, obvious, nor universally agreed upon way of reconciling these two seemingly disparate systems into a single coherent system, nor for that matter of explaining why the governing principles of matter at the subatomic level appear to shift when aggregated at the atomic level. Nevertheless, while we do not yet have a reasonable explanation for this disjunction, there is nearly universal agreement amongst physicists that however this apparent gap might eventually be bridged, it will not require a revision of the laws which we have thus far discovered, governing either. To the contrary, most physicists agree that in order to achieve their long sought after grand unifying theory, they need merely develop a richer understanding of the ground and condition of those physical laws, which have already been identified as operative at both levels. Thus, while those laws elude us to this day, most physicists agree that the laws which we have discovered are absolutely understood, accountable, and moreover, utterly stable and inviolable. So nothing they'll discover about the grand unified theory will overturn what they already know. So I think it's within this branch of physics that we must turn if we want to find a fundamental truth that we might be able to extract and speculate meaningfully about human nature from. After all, precisely such fundamental ideas have already been discovered and determined and defined by physicists. Absolute laws, which, as we understand more and more daily, govern entirely the structure and nature of every existent entity at every level, from the organic to the inorganic. In fact, some of these principles are so universally accepted within contemporary sciences that Frank Wilczek, a Nobel laureate in physics, has suggested they could be treated as nothing short of, quote, fundamental principles, which he compares to the religious doctrines and dogmatisms which populated the late Middle Ages. So you see, that's why I think naturalism is an inversion of late Middle Age scholasticism. A prime example of such fundamental laws, or a set of laws in this case, are the laws of thermodynamics. Indeed, these laws, more than any other, are increasingly used in contemporary sciences to explain the origin, operation, and end of material reality at every level. Indeed, their power and function in nearly every form of material science is so prevalent today that contemporary physicist Carlo Rovelli has suggested that the entire history of scientific development in the 20th century could in many ways be told as nothing more than a history of the expansion and application of the laws of thermodynamics. In the course of the 20th century, he writes, thermodynamics and statistical mechanics have been expanded to even include electromagnetics and quantum phenomena, end quote. Thus, from their humble beginning in applied engineering, thermodynamic principles have come to dominate nearly every branch of the material sciences today. Indeed, according to biologist Addie Pross, they are increasingly seen as the single regulating system, quote, of all material systems, end quote. The universal acceptance of the laws of thermodynamics in the material sciences is in fact so absolute today that none other than Albert Einstein, you might have heard of him, has noted that, quote, it is the only physical theory which I am convinced that within the framework of the applicability of its basic concepts will never be overthrown, end quote. Einstein's confidence in the constancy and power of thermodynamics was so great, in fact, that he declared it, quote, the firm and definitive foundation for all physics, and indeed the whole of the natural sciences, end quote. So I think it's from these laws that we might be able to extract an account of the nature of reality itself and therefore human nature. But this requires refamiliarizing ourselves briefly with these laws. So you see, we're getting real in the weeds here, but I'm going to tie it together, I promise. Just bear with me. At first glance, the three basic laws of thermodynamics are relatively straightforward and easily understood. When those simple laws are applied to diverse systems, however, their meaning and significance becomes extraordinarily profound. The first of these laws, known as the law of the conservation of energy, states that energy, as motion, matter, or heat, can neither be created nor destroyed within a closed system, but can only ever change states within that system. Thus, while the total amount of energy within a system may appear to lessen as matter dissipates, motion slows down, and or things cool off, the total amount of energy within that system is ultimately always constant, albeit manifest in different forms. It's upon this law that Einstein famously established his equation to measure the conversion of matter to energy, E equals mc squared. And it's subsequently this law that allows us to predict the productive power of every heat engine, from small motors powering backyard mowers across our nation to the nuclear fusion fueling the radioactive output of the sun at the center of our planetary system. The second, and perhaps most famous of the laws of thermodynamics, states that statistically, energy flows within any given system in such a way that over time, it becomes evenly distributed across that system, moving generally from more organized and concentrated to less integral and more dissipated. This tendency towards disorder, known as entropy, either in the form, means that every closed system tends towards a state of absolute energy equilibrium, where no one thing possesses any more or less energy, either in the form of motion, matter, heat, etc., than any other thing. It is this law which physicists use to explain that, in the words of the great poet William Butler Yeats, things fall apart, and that time moves in only one direction, namely towards disintegration and destruction. As a result, it is this law which physicists argue is the only real factor which distinguishes the past from the future and gives rise to what we experience in the present as the arrow of time. It's therefore due to this law that, in the words of Stephen Hawking, while we may reasonably expect a cup which has fallen from the table onto the floor to shatter into a number of smaller pieces, we cannot reasonably expect to see broken cups gathering themselves together off the floor and jumping back on the table. Such accounts of redemption are entirely supernatural. It is the second law of thermodynamics, then, which assures us that as the entropic disorder of a system increases, everything within that system will likewise shatter into increasingly smaller pieces until everything is relatively equal in nature and evenly distributed across the system. All disequilibrium is dispelled, and the perfect harmony of total uniformity and absolute nothingness is achieved. From this, the third law of thermodynamics follows, stating that since entropy must necessarily increase with every closed system, the way outlined by the second law, the logical end of the perpetual dissipation and collapse is a state in which every existent thing possesses the absolute lowest total amount of energy possible, a state known as absolute zero. Also, by the way, my personality. The ultimate expression of this state is, of course, a system in which there are no complex forms of energy at all, like classical objects, but instead only a low-level background radiation which is evenly distributed across a system. It is this law, then, which allows us to know with absolute certainty that while energy can neither be created nor destroyed in keeping with the first law of thermodynamics, it can nevertheless burn out, as it were, and reach a state in which it has no effective mechanical power, demonstrate no motion or change, nor contain within it any potential for what we might think of as objective existence, motion, or change. Such a totalizing, annihilative null state is what is promised and guaranteed by the third law of thermodynamics. It is the absolute end of reality, presuming, of course, that the universe is a sufficiently closed system. Now, armed with these three laws, contemporary scientists in almost every field have been able to speculatively construct an almost complete picture of the origin, operation, and eventual end of our universe. For example, within astrophysics, these laws have been used to explain the sudden appearance and development of the cosmos roughly 13.7 billion years ago, from an extremely dense, hot, and low entropic singularity of time-space to the ever-expanding and cooling universe we find ourselves in today. Not to mention the formation of all the relatively higher entropic material objects we find therein, like galaxies, nebulae, black holes, quasars, stars, planets, moons, meteors, asteroids, and you. Not only can astrophysicists use the laws of thermodynamics to explain the accretion, nature, and movement of such objects, they can even use them to predict their relative distribution within the universe, all using the same statistical models developed by Ludwig Boltzmann in the 19th century to predict the output of small engines. That's also from these same basic laws that theoretical physicists have abstracted the origin, nature, and operation of time itself, as Einstein first suggested and Stephen Hawking subsequently developed. As contemporary theoretical physicist Sean Carroll puts it, the property of entropy is responsible for all of the differences between past and future that we know about. Memory, aging, cause and effect, all can be traced to the second law of thermodynamics, and in particular to the fact that entropy used to be low in the past, end quote. On a much smaller scale, it was Erwin Schrödinger's great insight that the laws of thermodynamics might rest upon, operate within, and perhaps even govern the seemingly random nature of quantum systems. This insight has more recently given way to one of the most dynamic areas of contemporary physics, called quantum thermodynamics, which was first pioneered by John von Neumann in 1932, where he developed a new model of entropic decay more equipped to measure and predict quantum motion than Boltzmann's original atomic model. What's more, most contemporary physicists agree it will likely be through the development of these first-order principles which govern thermodynamic exchanges at the quantum level that the first-order principles which govern all of existence itself might be discovered, and through them, potentially, maybe even the long-sought-after grand unified theory of reality. This is, in fact, the claim of John Joe McFadden and Al-Khalali. In this way, from their relatively humble beginnings within applied mechanical physics, the laws of thermodynamics have steadily come to pervade and reign in nearly every branch of contemporary physics, from the most practical to the most theoretical, and subsequently into every other material science. Within chemistry, so we're working our way back up the chain now. Within chemistry, for example, as a result of Willard Gibbs' analysis of the movement of energy within thermodynamic systems, Gilbert N. Lewis and Merle Randall, followed closely by E.A. Guggenheim, were able to determine and outline the basic laws which govern chemical reactions, laws which are still used and taught in chemistry classrooms today. Even more famously, Marie Curie used the laws of thermodynamics to identify and define the principles which give rise to radioactive decay within chemical structures, and subsequently showed how those laws allow us to predict with absolute certainty the slow dissolution and transformation of chemical elements into their most basic components. It was from her pioneering application of the laws of thermodynamics in chemistry that we have been able to subsequently explain the emergence of every existent chemical compound and substance, from the first few moments of the rapid expansion of our universe to their eventual dissolution into pure heat energy at a distant end, when in fact, chemical compounds themselves will dissolve. There will be no meaningful atomic structures. Perhaps nowhere, however, has the explanatory power moving back up the chain of the laws of thermodynamics been more impactful than within biology, where they have been increasingly relied upon in recent years to explain both the basic nature and function of living organisms, as well as their initial development from inorganic matter and their subsequent evolution into more complex structures like you and me. Such an application was, of course, first suggested by Erwin Schrödinger in his 1944 lectures, What is Life? But it was through the detailed lab work of Jacques Monod and others that the role of thermodynamic exchange in the evolution of living DNA self-replicators from mechanical RNA engines, and from that, the explosion of complex life in toto, that the application of thermodynamics has come to dominate the biological sciences today. As a result, thermodynamic principles are now the bedrock of every contemporary understanding of biological nature, operation, and evolution. Indeed, contemporary biologists are increasingly convinced that life is best understood as nothing more than a highly complex dissipative structure, which the physicist Nick Lane has described as the visible product of a sustained, far from equilibrium condition. Read through the lens of the laws of thermodynamics, most contemporary biologists agree that not only does complex life appear to be an effect of the dissipation of energy across a system, but moreover, living things are perhaps best understood as a sort of dissipative machine, nothing more than the most efficient way in which energy can be broken down into its most basic form and more quickly distributed across the cosmos. Thus, as biologist Peter Hoffman has argued, living systems are dissipative systems because they continuously distribute free energy into high entropy energy. Hopefully at this point, you're already beginning to see some import into how we might think of the human. But let me go on for a moment, because it gets even more interesting. This basic insight of the role of thermodynamic exchange in biological nature has more recently inspired biophysicist Jeremy England to model in his lab precisely how the dissipation of heat across the system, in accordance with the second laws of thermodynamics, might lead directly to the self-organization of atoms into the kind of structures necessary for the development of life, not to mention how those same laws might explain the evolution of life into its more complex form. This work has led England to suggest that ultimately the only explanation for the why of life is that its aim or teleonomic function is to aid entropy. Life, England argues, is ultimately a kind of entropic machine, one which uses its complexity to destroy other complex energetic forms and render them into their simplest possible structure, thus aiding the dissipation of energy and matter across the system and the eventual annihilation of existence itself. As England puts it, quote, many of the properties of living things might be explainable as dissipative structures that arise from a general thermodynamic tendency to reduce the rate of entropy production. Thus, England concludes, the empirical biological fact that reproductive fitness is intimately linked to efficient metabolism now has a clear and simple basis in physics, end quote. Such a process, he writes in conclusion, must invariably be fueled by the production of entropy, end quote. Hence again, Sean Carroll's conclusion, and this is important, that the purpose of life from a material and scientific naturalistic perspective is solely the destruction of matter, the conversion of matter to energy. Read in this light, Carroll argues the purpose of life is nothing more than metabolism. Essentially, he writes, burning fuel, end quote. Such a claim makes sense, he concludes, given the simple fact that living organisms, quote, like no other chemical reactions or combinations thereof, proceeds by converting free energy into disordered energy. Or, as Nick Lane puts it, life is not much like a candle, but more like a rocket launcher when it comes to its efficiency at transforming matter into energy. We're a destructive mechanism. Indeed, there appears to be no more efficient agent of entropy than living organisms. Nothing which is quite so effective at transforming energy from a relatively low entropic state, like matter, into a relatively higher entropic state, like heat, such that it can be more evenly distributed. Life, as it turns out, is not, as the poet Václav Havel put it, a struggle against entropy. To the contrary, life is one of the most efficient means through which the entropic dispersion of energy is realized. Thus, as the biologist Peter Hoffman has argued, quote, life does not exist despite the second law of thermodynamics. Instead, life has evolved to take full advantage of the second law wherever it can. Or, in the words of Sean Carroll, complex structures can form not despite the growth of entropy, but because entropy is always growing. Now, this is where we can extract from this speculatively, I think, some account of what a human being is and what its meaning and purpose might be. Yeah, steel yourselves. From this brief survey, it should be apparent that the laws of thermodynamics are not only absolute and inviolable within the natural world, they furthermore function to explain everything in our universe, from its origins to its emergence, its operation, its nature, function, and even its end. From beginning to end, top to bottom, macro to micro, the laws of thermodynamics hold fast and define the nature of all that is, all that can be, all that will ever happen, as well as the end of every possible happening itself. So it is from the perspective of the absolute law of entropic decay that I attempt in my own speculative naturalism to reason again about the nature of existence, the question of human meaning, and the question of value. In other words, it's from the perspective of thermodynamics that I think we need to reformulate some of the fundamental philosophical questions. Let me give you some examples. Within metaphysics, by way of example, I think that the concept of being must be reread in light of what we know about the nature of thermodynamics and its operation. What this leads to, I've argued elsewhere, is a novel and potentially controversial account of being, not as it has traditionally been understood as something which is either stable and eternally constant, or alternatively infinitely variable but everlastingly becoming, but instead as something which is fundamentally finite and irrevocably a destructive power. A power which slouches perpetually towards absolute annihilation. Being, within my account, is best understood as something which is, in every sense of the word, utterly unbecoming. I mean that both ontologically and morally. As strange and counterintuitive as such a claim is, I think it is entirely justified within a speculative extension of the testimony of the natural and material sciences. So again, you can see how this is a naturalistic, it's a speculative extension of testimonia of the sciences, direct witness. And the strengths of such a material grounded speculative metaphysics are manifold. For not only, as again I've argued elsewhere, does it allow us to ground and justify our claims in relation to those made by our colleagues in the natural sciences, it allows us to speculatively propose some teleological aim and potential meaning to the nature of being. Indeed, through such a metaphysics of unbecoming, I think we can account for being not only as its condition, as it's a condition for its own possibility, but the condition and operation of its own annihilation. In fact, such a metaphysics justifies an account of being as the very form and function through which the absolute ontological collapse of existence is accomplished. It is its own destroying principle. From this view, the apparent proliferation and multiplication of existent objects in the present moment, not to mention the possibility of change within and between them, is ultimately nothing more than a modality of the eventual extinction, dissipation, and coming nihilation of all that is. Indeed, I think we should come to know being anew as nothing more than an agent of oblivion. And it's from such a metaphysics of annihilation and obliviation, I would argue, that we should develop a new account of the human and extract from that some semblance of meaning and purpose to its being, not to mention moral value. And at some level, you're already familiar with this. All living things must die. This is a simple fact, which is inherent and inexorable to all life, structured and determined as it is by the second law of thermodynamics. Thus, despite our best efforts and all of the ingenuity of the modern sciences, death inevitably awaits us. This is all very well known. What is less well known, however, but equally true, is that this constant death is always already at work within us. Indeed, it's the very condition for the possibility of life itself. After all, it's this constant death which possibilizes our growth. This is why you have to exfoliate. That's not only a scientific fact, but also a beauty recommendation. The possibility of our growth and perpetuation. It's what fuels through our need to eat, which I see Tyler and Danny doing, work, love, and reproduce. So it is that the perpetual entropic decay, which will eventually conclude in our biological death, appears to be in many ways not only the final end, but the formal condition and efficient cause of our material existence. I hope you're hearing there a kind of reformation of the Aristotelian accounts of being. Thus, while we may hope and perhaps even strive to delay the final arrival of this end through diet, exercise, and the machinations of modern medicine, we must come to terms with the absolute fact that we will perpetually lose ground to the steady march of entropic decay, disintegration, and dissolution, and our ultimate demise will come, if not today, then tomorrow, or at least very soon on a cosmological time frame. Indeed, it is always already coming, and not in spite of, but precisely because of every attempt we make to keep it at bay. Of course, even this fact is not, though not as immediately recognized as the fact of death, also relatively well known. What is less well known, however, is how the second law of thermodynamics might help us to understand the nature, operation, and perhaps even the purpose of our lives in the meantime. Indeed, as we have just seen, every beat of our heart and pull of our lungs functions to further the effective dissipation of energy across our universe. Even the most complex life form is, from this perspective, little more than a profoundly efficient entropic machine. Through a speculative extension of this fact, we might therefore argue that the meaning and purpose of life is not only to eventually destroy itself, but in the meantime, to work to help destroy the universe as well. From this perspective, the human appears to be little more than a particularly effective cog in the annihilative machine that is being. A machine which is constantly working to dismantle itself. And in this way, I think we can use the second law of thermodynamics to extract not only an account of our nature, but an account of its potential meaning and purpose. Indeed, if any naturalistic meaning for the existence, for human existence can be speculatively extracted from the testimony of sciences, then I think it is this, that you, and indeed everything else, exists solely to consume, exterminate, and eventually expiate the entirety of reality. We are, I would argue, pistons in a cataclysmic machine, our existence constantly pumping to burn being into nothingness. From this, I think we can safely conclude that not only is our existence fundamentally and irrevocably finite, structured solely to end itself, but that therefore and moreover, existence is fundamentally antagonistic to itself, to the universe as a whole. In fact, indeed, as I argue in a manuscript which I recently completed, I think that every being is fundamentally and irrevocably at war with itself and every other being in existence at all times. What this means concretely is not only that all things exist merely to eventually decay, dissolve, and disappear, but that all things exist agonistically to eradicate themselves and to take as many other beings as they can with them in the process. What's more, I think the net result of all this agonistic striving towards nothing is the suffering and misery of every sentient creature in existence. I think if we can deduce any moral value from this fact, then it's this, that the classical assumption that existence is a moral good, or at the very least morally neutral, value neutral, that's demonstratively wrong. Given the entropic antagonism inherent to existence, the fact that the universe is not only indifferent to that which is, but is in fact actively striving to destroy all that is, I would argue that the moral value of existence is in fact less than zero. In point of fact, I would argue that the entirety of existence, yourselves included, is evil. Or to riff on the famous observation of Sophocles, I would argue that it's not good to be, that non-existence is better than existence, but best of all is never to have been born at all. Now, this may strike you as terrible news. Indeed, the worst possible news. But in point of fact, and I have to be short here, unfortunately, I actually think there's some good news here. Good news which can be extracted from this catastrophic bad news. Namely, that it provides a strategic enemy, a common point against which we can all work. In other words, it provides a natural foundation from which I think we might be able to derive a new set of universally normative laws negatively, and thereby unite our collective ethical aim. Indeed, as I argue in my latest manuscript, I think that such a recognition allows us to reconceive moral laws which we can all agree on, namely the attempt to resist in every way the natural trajectory of the universe, to alleviate the suffering it necessitates, and to creatively bend the entropic thrust of reality back upon itself, such that it might momentarily neutralize the agonistic and annihilative direction of existence. What's more, I think we can use this account of normativity to reconceive of a number of practical projects, like medicine and perhaps even politics. I mean, what is medicine if not the ultimate attempt to resist the annihilative aim of matter? And we call a good doctor one who doesn't say, hey, look, you're going to die anyway when I come in with an illness, but one who says, yes, I know death is inevitable, but I'm going to do everything I can to keep you alive. And yes, I realize that by keeping you alive, I might be elongating your suffering, and I might even be elongating the suffering of others, because as you're alive, you're going to consume other beings and burn fossil fuels and do all sorts of untold horrors in the justification of your weekend plans. But it's good to keep you alive and to keep everything alive for as long as we can. So what's interesting is that I think this is catastrophically bad news, but from this catastrophically bad news, I think we can negatively extract profoundly good news, namely the possibility of deriving a naturalistic basis for a new universal normativity. We can say, what is good? Fighting nature, being unnatural. That's why I like air conditioning. In this way, I would argue that though the facts of the universe are most definitely not good, some good can nevertheless be wrought from them, so long as we, through the use of reason, constrained by these material truths, that's speculative materialism, speculatively extend their possible meaning, use, and application. And in many ways, I think this is the sole task of my approach to philosophical naturalism, to use it to account again for things like moral absolutes, things which have traditionally been denied by moral naturalism and philosophical naturalism. Thank you very much. That is, thus endeth the lesson.
Thank you.
Now tolle legere.
Nice, thank you, Dr. Dalton. It's the tradition of the Socratic Club to engage in conversation, as I've suggested. I would like to, I know that there are some faculty members who are itching to make some comments or ask some questions, but I'd like to open questions first to students who are here. Is there a student who would like to ask a question, either by posting it on to the chat or just turn on your mic and ask away? Maybe it would be good if someone would raise a hand. Anyone? I know the faculty members will have plenty to say if a student doesn't step up, but I want to give a student the opportunity first.
In other words, if you're a student here, rescue me from the ire of your professors. I'm open to all questions, movie recommendations. I got more beauty tips. You know, I told you should exfoliate, but I got more, you know, contouring, anything. Andre Villalobos has asked in the chat, can I explain exactly what medieval epistemology is? I wouldn't say I could explain it exactly, but I'm sure many of your professors could. In fact, Douglas, I think is in here, was introduced to me as a medievalist early on. But I would say that basically, again, if we think about what the four, or at least four of the major ways of knowledge in the West, as revelation, tradition, reason, and empirical observation, right? I would say that what medieval epistemology is, at least by my accounting, is a privileging of revelation and tradition, right? So faith, which is received through the passing down of the wisdom of the saints, and belief, is used to guide the use of reason and science. So this is one of the reasons, at least one of the ways that the moderns themselves at least criticized much of medieval epistemology, because they said, well, it led to all sorts of things. You take things on faith because they're granted by tradition or they're revealed in the scriptures, and then you try to use your reason to figure things out. Like, so if the scriptures say, this is one of the classic examples the moderns used, that by holding his hands in the sky, Moses was able to stop the sun Is that Moses? Some biblical scholars will help me. Yeah. Then that means the sun must be going around the earth. That's revealed in the scripture. So if you believe, you have to believe that, and therefore we have to figure that out. So what a lot of modern epistemologists said, well, we got to reverse the way we think about how we gain knowledge. And that doesn't mean we exclude the possibility of something like revelation or tradition, biblical tradition. It just means that the primary guiding thread has to be something like reason and sciences. To me, a quintessential example of this would be Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding figures of this country, who famously tried to create an expurgated version of the New Testament, where he said, well, look, I think there's a lot of beauty which can be revealed in the tradition of the New Testament, but only if we take out all of the supernatural miraculous things. So he literally expurgated the miraculous from the New Testament. And that's a very modern way of thinking, right? Saying, hey, look, revelation and tradition, the tradition of the scriptures is fine, but it's got to be constrained by these other things. So it's that flip, it's that inversion that I take to be philosophical naturalism. I hope that helps, Andre. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, cool. But again, I would encourage you to take a course with Professor Kreis, because I assume as a medievalist, he's going to not only have a more nuanced account of these things. I'm painting in some broad strokes, and I'm doing it with the purposes of stoking vitriol, because philosophy is gadflyism, right? As again, Professor Lane can talk to you more about in one of the ancient courses. All right. Do you mind if I field my own questions here, David?
No, please go right ahead.
Lou Corones asks, oh gosh, it's scrolling too fast. Any spoiler on ideas for a new universal normativity that might support moral absolutes? Any moral absolute in particular? Yeah. That's a really great question. I think that when you look for framing moral absolutes positively, we're always going to struggle with that. To me, the moral absolutes which can be framed positively are precisely that existence is evil, that reality seems to be a nightmare. To me, what that then gives is an absolute foundation to frame moral normativity negatively. So I don't therefore think that any positive statements can necessarily be made about what one should or ought to do, but it gives us a direction, a strategic enemy that should and ought to be resisted. Now, any attempt to then reframe that is always going to result in a new moral absolute, which I think is going to be a kind of evil, but it gives us the thing to constantly work against. So for example, and that's why I gave medicine as example. I don't think it was a good thing that I have a child. I think I've demonstrably contributed to the misery of the universe. And if you know my kid, you know that to be true. But I'm going to do everything I can to sustain my kid's life and make my kid's life as good as possible while I can. Now, how do I justify that morally? Because I think that while things are here, while they exist, their beauty is in their desire to persist, even though they can't and they won't. That persistence works against the destructive nature of reality. So for example, if I give in, right? If I give in and I say, well, reality is going to destroy me anyway, that's what it's doing, it's evil, so I should just contribute and help it hasten it along, then I'm actually just complicit in the evil of the universe. I want to be non-complicit in the destructive aims of the universe. I want to say no, non servum, which was it's somewhat demonic, I understand, but in a nice way. But this was actually the topic of the Rukavina lecture in my last book, which is called The Ethics of Resistance. But that if any good can be achieved, it's through resisting and fighting with every ounce and strength of our bodies the trajectory in the direction of nature. Will you be successful? No, definitely not. You will fail miserably. And in fact, every attempt to do so will only compound and contribute to more evil. The longer I live, the more shit I can consume and more energy I can burn. So I'm actually, but again, it's a kind of Camus Sisyphean task, and yet it is not meaningless to do that. So I will keep rolling my impossible boulder of trying to be good by here's another example, creativity, where you take refuse and you try to turn it into something momentarily to suspend these things. I also think, I think we can even extract potentially politically normative things from this. We should resist any political system which all too easily gives us over to nature. I don't know. There's a couple of things here, but I would, if you're interested in talking more about this, Lou, I would encourage you to call your local publisher and ask them to take this book. but I joke. But once it's out, I'd be happy to send it to you. But also, the last book that came out was a kind of prelude to this, and it's called The Ethics of Resistance. The subtitle is called The Tyranny of the Absolute, and it's all about how the absolute always threatens us with the possibility of evil. Okay, Raja asks, how can delaying suffering while knowing that it causes more suffering to other people? Oh, great. Yeah. Okay, Raja, no, nailed it, right? You nailed it. That's precisely the conundrum here, that goodness can't really be achieved, right? Like, so let's say you're a medical doctor and you see someone come in who has a gunshot wound. You know that, like, if you actually did the calculation, you're going to be contributing to less moral suffering if you just let them die, right? Not only will they not have to deal with the suffering of recovery, but they won't have to deal with the suffering of the medical bills in our particular political situation, nor just the existential suffering of getting to 40, 50, 60 and having to deal with all of this crap. I mean, like, I wake up twice in the night to have to pee. It's terrible. Like, just the amount of suffering that goes on the longer you live. It's just, and not only that, in the meantime, I'm contributing to more suffering. Like, I'm buying stuff and I'm burning fossil fuels to get to work. It's just, I'm a repugnant person, as we all are. Well, with some exceptions. Professor Tritton and Lane may be the exception, but and yet it would be morally repugnant to simply let them go into that good night, to let the wound be mortal, because by doing that, I'm simply being complicit. So no matter what I do, I will contribute to the greater suffering. My goal is to nevertheless work against it, to try to alleviate it. I will fail. I will not achieve the morally good thing. That's why I was saying in reply to, I think, Lou, you can't frame moral goods positively. You can only frame them negatively. You can frame moral evils positively, I think. Right. So I think my goal is got to be to fight at any given particular instance the evil that I see before me. When I see somebody hungry on the street, to feed them. When I see them naked, to clothe them. Now I realize that by feeding them and clothing them, I'm contributing to their longevity and their prolonged life, and that in the total count. But in that immediate specific moment, and I'm going to do everything I can to resist the trajectory of nature over them, because I think nature is the son of a gun. Do you like the way I self-edited there? I'm not really very good at that, but I refrained from using a bad word. Okay. I don't know if that helps, Raja, but I don't know, man. I'm just trying to figure this junk out. Matthew Krause, looking dapper in his hoodie. If life is such an efficient and/or effective source for entropy, giving entropy primacy, wouldn't the universe seek to enhance, increase amount of cycling efficiency of life to feed entropy? Yeah, it does. If so, can we view the universe as timeless? Oh no, unfortunately, no. Okay, I see what you're saying. So here's the thing. It's true that the universe spontaneously produces seemingly less entropic objects, right? As opposed to just burning itself off in heat, like, again, planets, and then from planets, us. So we have this proliferation of things. But what most contemporary biophysicists are saying is that this is a means to an end. It's a momentarily accretion to burn off things more efficiently. So the ultimate end of that burning off is not the production of more things. And eventually, like, so think about how nuclear fission works. Like, it's like speeding up. There's increased complexity, complex exchanges, all with the purpose of burning out super, super quickly, so that eventually there's nothing. And most physicists would argue, and in a longer version of this paper, I sort of tease out the debates about the ends of the universe and what happens at the heat death of the universe versus what's called the big rip versus all these sorts of things. But the consensus of most contemporary physicists is that there will be what's called the cosmological dark ages in the time to come, when all meaningful possibility of existence will have burnt out. So we will reach a kind of fever pitch of beings that will be used to burn everything out. Now, where we are in that, that's up for debate. And what the nature of the universe after that will look like is also up for debate. A lot of that depends on whether we're an open closed system. And a lot of that also, of course, therefore depends on the, multiverse sort of debates, et cetera, which is really just a fun, and at least in my opinion, another a contemporary form of scholasticism. I think it's kind of mathematical theorizing gone awry. But yeah. So here's the thing. I would feel very hopeful if, in the words of Nietzsche, there was evidence for eternal return. That in the big, what's called bounce theory, that, you know, things kind of expand, grow out, and then eventually kind of start collecting, boom. And that was a super cool and popular theory back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it's just, there's not enough evidence to support it. In fact, all the evidence is against it. So it seems to me that life, like cancer cells, there's increasing complexity in my body as the cancer cells spread and divide and multiply, and eventually it'll overtake and consume me entirely, and I'll just, you know, go. But I think that's the nature of life as well, you know. But they're so beautiful in the meantime.
Dr. Tritton and/or Dr. Lane has a question here.
Well, I know my husband has a slew of questions because I saw him writing them as you were speaking. Mine's a simple question that actually is a follow-up from what you just said. And thank you so much. This was just a wonderful talk, inspiring and fun and quirky, as you always are.
I'm not sure what's inspiring, but
I don't know. I think it's inspiring. I mean, there's so much the novelty of the ideas. I just really, I mean, I radically disagree with you on so many different levels. But the soundness of the argument is quite compelling and can suck us all into like doom and gloom. But let's resist. So no, very good. Mike, to follow up from what Matthew was asking and what you alluded to. So your entire project, right, is based upon the absoluteness of nothingness, right? And, you know, there's this ringing of Freud and, death drive of the entire universe that's trying to return to this state of nothingness. But as you just said, with regards to and it's all based upon a close reading of contemporary physics, right? Because this is where we have to jump off from to be doing proper speculative work with your speculative materialism. And so you're basing it off this, but you just admitted a few seconds ago that, you know, what happens after this, you know, final entropy state, this collapse of everything and into nothingness. Scientists are still up in the air, and whether it's the rip or whatnot. And the problem is that you know, you're already yourself, you know, kind of aware that there are questions about this after, right? And that science is going towards this otherwise than the end of entropy. And so I just wonder if this is an incomplete system that's based upon perhaps the middle rather than the so-called actual end. And so, that's my basic. And of course, I love this because it feels very Heraclitean. It feels very Empedoclean, with the exception of the lack of the return. So, anyways, thank you.
No, thank you. First of all, let me point out that Professors Lane and Tritton are two of my closest friends in the world. And I actually think it's a wonderful example of what philosophical friendship is. We disagree very radically with each other in very, very different ways, but we disagree so productively. And I think that right there is one of the most beautiful definitions of friendship you have, is productive disagreement, as opposed to destructive disagreement, which is what I think we witness oftentimes. And I think what's given things like the idea of critical feedback or critical thinking a bad name, is we think the crisis of criticism is always cutting as opposed to healing. So I always love disagreeing with Professor Lane and Professor Tritton. But I do think in this case it's true. Scientists are not yet certain about the exact nature of the end, but not in the way that you're thinking about. So not in the sense of it's totally open. They're debating about how precisely nothingness will come about. So they go, hey, look, these laws are incontrovertible. They are the foundation of everything we observe in the universe. And they are heading directly in this direction. And we know that the end of that is utter obliteration. Now, the way that obliteration is going to happen, oh, there we're starting to split hairs. I mean, so some call it the big freeze, some call it the big rip, some call it the big nothing. I mean, like, so it's kind of like saying this: I know it is absolutely determined with utter certainty that I'm going to die. I am utterly convinced by that. All the science tells me it, reasoning tells it to me. Now, I realize you haven't observed my specific death, but one of the basic arguments which we use to teach kind of deductive reasoning is, Socrates is mortal, all people, blah, 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 blah. So Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, therefore. Maybe, do I have my S term and my P term reversed? But okay. But how specifically I'm going to die, I don't know. Will I be bludgeoned by my students? Will I die in a tragic steamroller accident? I'm not sure yet, but I do know that I'm going to die. So in a similar way, the universe, we know, most scientists agree with absolute certainty, is going to die in every meaningful sense. How specifically it's going to die, we're not sure. So the cautious welcome to the openness of science is still that, well, we're still working with every day greater detail, finessing these things and figuring them out. But the end is certain, I think. But that's, again, I think it's that certainty. And Raja asked a follow-up question. I think I can tie this in. It's that certainty, which I think is precisely what can ground anew certain moral normatives, right? So here's the problem. Like, we live in a time in which people are absolutely, I'm using that term facetiously, but are very reluctant to declare something like a universal moral normativity. They're very reluctant to do it. And it seems to me, okay, maybe it's because we keep pursuing moral normativity positively. We keep wanting to be able to determine claims, this is right, this is wrong, as if it can be declared absolutely. And I think maybe the problem is, well, what if we just stop with the this is right part in terms of making positive moral statements? We say, well, here's one thing that's wrong. Death is bad. And yet death is the fundamental part of life. And so what do I do to possibilize little deaths and minimize big deaths? So I just think it gives us this strategic common ground. It gives us this strategic enemy that we can all universally agree upon, and then work out the details of how and where we do that separately. So Raja, you're absolutely right. I think that resistance, despite its ultimate futility, is the best model for a moral normativity in this account of reality, right? So I'm not saying, there are other, if this account of reality is wrong and science changes its perspective, hey, I'll be the first to celebrate. I really would. I've got no problem with dying so long as the universe cares about me and wants to do something with it. I would totally redeem it for me, but there's no evidence that it does. In fact, just the opposite. I fell and skinned my knee today, and the street didn't seem to give a damn. Because it doesn't. But I think precisely its indifference is what makes it in some sense a moral evil. But that's a different argument. That's actually also in the forthcoming book, where I argue that the absence of moral concern has precisely always been defined as a kind of depravity. And so the universe is depraved.
All right, I was going to ask a follow-up, but I'm going to, Doug can go, and then maybe Tyler.
Okay, well, let's go. I'll go ahead and go back to the first question you invited me to respond to, Professor Dalton, about medieval epistemology. So there was medieval philosophical naturalism. There was philosophical naturalism in the ancient world. It was based on the notion of natural kinds, or Aristotelian substantial forms, or Platonic ideas. It was based on the notion that they're really those pine trees behind Dr. Treleaven really are different from the sunflowers behind Dr. Treleaven, and not just different in the sense that they're different constellations of atoms or different constellations of particles, all of which are fundamentally the same. But no, there's another principle that's needed to explain different life forms, and that principle Aristotle called substantial form, and all pre-modern biology is based on that notion. And it seems to me that modern biology is too. So to me, the key step in your argument, in Professor Dalton's argument, is the step in which he reduces biology to physics, so that everything is just, they're just clusters of particles or atoms, all subject to the same identical principles. But here it seems, I mean, I guess I'd kind of turn the argument, so you're concerned about how to explain moral absolutes or anything
Wait,
good.
can I pause you before you make that turn really quickly? Just
Sure.
as a teaching moment for Lou, who had asked the question initially. So what Douglas had just said about philosophical naturalism in the medieval world is absolutely correct. So bear in mind, when I addressed philosophical naturalism here, you'll remember I kind of went through, so I don't want you to think that philosophical naturalism there's not a naturalism in medieval epistemologies. And you may remember, Lou, in the definition I gave, I kept sort of narrowing it down, how I'm defining it, how I'm defining it, how I'm defining it. And so he's absolutely right that there's naturalism in the medieval world. But one of the things you'll note in that naturalism, particularly in the medieval world, is that they'll say, well, the world there is a natural morality, for example, that one can deduce from observation of the world. But I've always thought that that was still based on a belief that there is something like a good. So I just want to, that's just a precising definition there for you, Lou, who had asked that question. And one of the questions David and I first discussed when I said, so you want me to present on naturalism? What exactly do you mean by naturalism? And I even said, Douglas, you'll appreciate, I said, well, do you mean Christian moral naturalism? Do you mean medieval naturalism? And he said, well, given the context, what we're really looking for is somebody. And I said, is it okay if I stereotype myself then and stereotype naturalism as a kind of scientific reductionism? And he's like, yeah, that'd be fun. So I do want to point out, I was being intentionally reductive in my definition there. So just to back up what Professor Kreis is saying. So, but go ahead, proceed with your question though.
Okay, so my question would actually be this. You seem concerned about how to explain what good would mean, or what morality would demand of us in this universe that you've described, governed especially by the second law of thermodynamics. My question is, well, you said at one point that Francis Crick was a terrible human being. I wonder how you can make that claim.
Yeah, here's how.
Is anything evil?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So everything is evil. It's just the opposite. Nothing is good.
Okay.
So the claim is precisely that everything is evil. That goodness is what doesn't exist. There is no natural kind goodness. Goodness is entirely, I think, negatively defined. It's a privative category. So I'm trying to reverse the traditional moral categories, where evil is seen as a privative of the sunum bonum of nature, which would be the kind of, by the way, going back to Lou, your question, in the Middle Ages, the nature was seen as a primary good, right? And so it's deprivations in nature, which would be seen as evil. I think it's the opposite. Nature is evil. It's deprivations in nature, which are good. So for example, why I think Crick was a terrible human being. Well, you may remember I mentioned he was a eugenicist and a sexist. I think eugenicists and sexists, by and large, are using arguments to try to reduce the proliferation and freedoms of individuals and restrict them to what they consider to be their basic and natural function. Anybody who wants me to just be natural and restrict me to what they consider to be nature, I think is doing a terrible moral harm. I think I want to proliferate humans to be as unnatural and weird and exceptional as they possibly can be. So when you tell me, for example, hey, look, women have a nature, and I just want them to live up to their nature, I think you're probably an evil SOB. If you say that Jews just have a nature, I'm a Jew, and they should just like go be with their natural kind, I think that's a terrible thing to say. I want to complicate nature as much as possible by proliferating all sorts of unnatural ways of being. If that makes any sense. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious here, but I that would be, to go with Crick, that would be how I would sort of make that sort of call. But here's the great thing I would also say, yes, but mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I am also participating in evil in all sorts of horrible and unknown ways that I'm not aware of. And moral goodness for me means constantly exturbating myself to scrutiny and discovering the ways in which I am, unbeknownst to me, being complicit in the harm that the universe is working in and through me, and trying to find new and better ways to not do that. So, for example, when people go, look, I'm sorry, I'm not good with pronouns, but I just wasn't raised that way. It's not natural to me. Okay, stop being natural. Start being unnatural. Start being complicating what you consider to be nature. That to me seems to be good in that sense. Is that, I don't know if that helps.
Well, you said at the end there that seems to you good, and I don't understand why it's good.
Simply because it's the opposite of evil, which I think is the primary category.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm defining it like good is entirely privative in my definition. It's entirely deduced from evil as the primary moral category. There is no good in an
I guess my question is, how can you distinguish between good and evil?
Well, in an ultimate teleological sense, you can't, because evil wins the day. It is what is. It is the only natural category. It is the sunum, full stop. So if any sense of the good is going to be retained, and I think it has a purpose of being retained, it has to be retained exclusively privatively, exclusively as a disjunctive function. So if you think about the traditional ways in which we sort of use logic to deduce things, right? So you can think about it as a categorical claim. So there's categorical good. This is a Kantian thing, and from that we can deduce other goods from that categorical claim, right? You can do it hypothetically. If this is good, then these other things are good. One of the things that strikes me as strange is we very rarely use it disjunctively. Either something is evil or it's the opposite. And so I think it's kind of a disjunctive reasoning. Goodness is not a thing. There's only relative not badness.
So following up from that, because, I think about, I'm a Neoplatonist, right? And so, everything derives from the good and all the way until it is exhausted to the point of matter, right? Which is the total, perversion or privation or the deficit of the good. And so if we're going to turn this system upside down, is what I think is what you're trying to do, right? That all the way to the lowest levels, there would still be a trace of evil, right? And so that it's exhausting itself out all the way to its depths. So at the end of the day, at the bottom in this system, where the good is nothingness, right? There's still going to be a trace of something. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not exactly sure. I think maybe.
Sorry, let me put it this way. For the Platonist, there's always the good is always in all things, no matter how far removed. And what you're saying is evil is in all things, no matter how far removed or how much it resists.
Yeah. And I just want to be less evil. I'm defining the good as simply being less evil. Yeah. You might remember, Professor Lane, I've joked with you that I consider myself a materialist Manichaean. So I like to joke that matter is evil, but I'm a materialist, so it's the only thing that there is. So yeah, it's something along that line. But so again, Douglas, to go back, I think the good as a logical category is a category of evil. It's that category. It is just like it's a category of being. It is that category which attempts to resist and pervert the natural order. And I think that's the only sense, a meaningful sense of the concept good that I can refrain in this. But I do think here's the interesting thing. It motivates to me all sorts of very useful normative things that almost in some sense just redefines and refounds some of my moral intuitions, such as they're defined within philosophy. You know what I mean? So like I gave the example of medicine, or keeping my child alive, or clothing the homeless, or feeding the sick. Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for the sick, whatever it is we do in hospitals these days, and billing them later. I think it's a new naturalistic foundation for supporting what we kind of intuitively are already trying to do, fighting and striving to survive, even though it's not good to do that. But it's better than the alternative. By the way, okay, so check it out. This kind of is a way of tying in Chris Frankovich's question. How have persons ever not been in resistance? Like, is there ever a moment where they're not resisting? Here's the really interesting thing, I think. You're right. It seems that we're by nature resisting, right? And this is the kind of classic Václav Havel thing, that by nature, biology swims upstream against entropy. This is kind of Havel's kind of classic argument. And it was like what a lot of people, like you even saw it, Schrodinger seemed to suggest this early on, but this is not really what we understand now, because we now know that every swimming upstream against entropy is actually an effective entropy aimed at increasing, right? These things. So here's what I would say. If you're looking for examples of when people are not in resistance, genocide is a really good example. You say, well, these people are going to die anyway, so it doesn't do any real moral harm, and it makes things better for us, so let's just eliminate them. I think reducing people exclusively to their biology and the identification of their sex or gender, and therefore sexual orientation, seems to me to be a moral evil in that regard as well. Because again, it's the similar thing. You are, you're not resisting nature. You're trying to let nature define and let it have its course. So again, here's a good example. I am absolutely against accelerationism. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah. So again, if somebody comes in, let's imagine I'm a doctor, and says, hey, look, I'm ill. Without your treatment, I'm going to die. And I go, well, you're going to die anyway, and you don't have the money to pay the bills. I would say, well, there you are. That's a good example of somebody refusing to resist. Refusing to resist the trajectory of nature, letting nature just happen. Hey, what's going to happen is going to happen. I can't do anything about it. When you pass a homeless person, you feel that twinge of responsibility, and you go, look, it's not what's going to happen is going to happen. That's not resisting.
I was actually not thinking about resistance as a psychological or behavioral thing as much as an ontological statement that, as you seem to be saying, that it just seems like in the entropic nature of scientifically reduced reality, this is what's been going on, and this is what evolutionary theory is arguing with, and some people would say against, but it seems to have always been the case that that there's struggle and suffering everywhere. I just don't, but there's, anyway, that's what I was meaning. That
I see. Yeah, I think you're right, though.
It's always been ubiquitous. So I don't know why what you're saying so much is different, except that it's flipping this in the kind of normative, in just an epistemological sense, in a belief sense, not. And I think that maybe is where I certainly get distressed hearing it, because I like to believe that the universe is a good place, not a bad place, notwithstanding the fact that everything is going to die and we suffer. One other point, just while I've got the time here,
please.
You said that the dissipative structures are the nature of organized life, which seems to be the case, assuming a closed system.
Yeah.
And that we assume that the universe is a closed system.
Right.
But that logically just becomes very difficult when we posit our, the opposite of that is open. What could possibly be beyond everything? What could possibly be beyond a closed system? So it seems to me that rather than succumbing to a despair over the negativity, we could just assume ever more complex horizons.
Yeah, I mean, I think assuming the openness of a system is a beautiful thing, and that's called faith, and that's called belief. However it is you justify that faith and that belief. But I think one of the things I'm fundamentally saying is that I don't think that faith and belief as a grounding epistemological thread is a good thing. I think it leads to all sorts of things because ultimately it's not justifiable. And I want to make claims which are justifiable. So at least justifiable by natural means now. So that's that. With regards to resistance, I have a feeling we might be equivocating a bit. We might have slightly different definitions of what we mean by resistance. You're right. Like, life is constantly struggle. Suffering seems to be necessitated by the nature of existence itself. By resistance, I meant a very determinate attempt to say no to the structures of the universe, even though you know you will fail. This is actually outlined in the book that I last published, which I presented the Rukavina lecture on, called The Ethics of Resistance. So I'm using a very specific definition of resistance there as opposed to rebellion. So I think that, I'm not just meaning the strife of life that seems to be inherent. You're absolutely right, that, but that we might think, so resistance is in a direct and intentional opposition to the rule or the reign of the absolute, right? So if nature, if the rule or reign of nature is entropic, we might think that birth, life, is an innate form of resistance. And that's indeed what science thought up until about the 1960s, 70s. Now we realize, no, this is an operation of the entropic nature. It is simply an expansion of the entropic nature. It is speeding along the entropic nature of the universe. And so, a metaphor that a lot of people use for life oftentimes is that if existence, if being is a downward rushing stream, you might think of life as these little momentary eddies, these backward turning relations to the stream as a whole. That's only true if that backward turning eddy is used to further the speed of the thing. We're more like a ripple on the surface. And it looks as if some complex structure has arisen, which is different than the underlying flow of the thing. But in fact, it's just a perpetuation of the flow of the thing. And so I want to say, I want to be a ripple which strives to break free. Will I be successful? Absolutely not. Definitely 100% not. But I'm going to try because it seems to me that this stream, in the words of my kid, sucks ass. So it is a bad thing. She has a terrible mouth. I don't know where she gets that from. It's definitely not me. I have not contributed to that nature. Tyler has asked, and I know we probably need to go soon, David, but can I just?
We've already gone over a little bit, but that's all right. Let's let Tyler have one final question here. I have a bunch I would like to ask, but that's okay. We'll let Tyler have one.
It wasn't me, it was Dandy.
Okay.
And I plan on haranguing Drew sometime.
He's going to be here next month.
You harangue me all the time anyway.
Yeah. Well, sometime, all the time, whatever. But no, so I'll let David ask and then, yeah.
And by the way, Lou just asked a quick question we can answer really quickly. Is it conclusively proven that our universe is a closed system? No, it's not. It is the prevalent assumption. But at least amongst physicists, though some mathematical theoretical physicists are starting to question that. The whole concept of the multiverse, in fact, is a question of that. So no, it is not. So again, hey, Lou, pray for me. Pray that I live long enough that the closed system is overturned. That's salvation to me. But notice either way, and this goes back to the philosophical naturalism, I'm not wedded to my theory. My theory grows from the science. This is the prevailing science at the time. If the science proves that there's an open system, hey, then all things are on the table. Who knows? Although, of course, what a lot of people would say is, well, isn't the multiverse itself perhaps a closed system? Unless, again, there's something outside of it, which, again, seems to imply a kind of faith claim. Here's what Tyler is asking about faith, by the way. Isn't it demonstratively left? I'm not sure, but Dandy, but we'll talk more about that. David, final words.
Well, actually, I had a question about nature, but I'd like to hear what you say in response to the faith resisting the certainty of death. And so there's a sense in which the ultimate form, I think if I'm taking, whether it's Tyler or Danny, whoever posted that comment, that faith then is the ultimate form of resistance. And your comment to that would be maybe, but it's not grounded in rationality. That's the claim you'd want to make?
No, I think it could be. No, so it's just the opposite. I think faith is a negatively produced object. This is awful. There, in the words of the great 20th century poets, more than this, there's got to be something more than this. So I like. Sorry, I'm blanking on that band's name right now, but I've got it on vinyl down. It's Roxy Music. So in the words of Roxy Music, more than that, man, I think if it's rationally grounded as a negative thing, like, man, this is just terrible. And in fact, like These three things remain, my Jesuit friends: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. It seems to me that these are three different ways of talking about the same thing. And what is love if not a way of going, when I love my kid and when I have hope in the future, I know, in the words of Philip Larkin, that they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They give you all the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. True. And yet I hope that I've done my duty and decreased the suffering of my child and not handed on misery. I hope, foolishly, because I know that my kid will go to her therapist and complain about me in the same way I go to my therapist and complain about my parents. Onwards, backwards through the dawn of time. So when they were just cave people therapists, just clunk you in the head. But I think like that is, I think, a form of faith. That's a form of hope. And notice it's a negative operator. But then what I like about that kind of faith is it has no content. It doesn't make any declarative or positive statements. So I'm not into a Nicene faith. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, unseen, right? That's, to me, it would have to be a kind of apophantic faith, and or a faith which I've argued in another article is demonstrated in deeds that are concretely aimed at alleviating the suffering of the hungry. I don't know anything about Platonic faith.
Well, that was an eloquent closure, I think, to this interesting question. If I'd ask, well, I'm going to try to restrain myself. But if I'd ask anything about that, it would just be to relate that to, I think, for example, William James gives us a picture of how a faith is a pushing against I think I would call it the fictionalized certainty that's given to us by the sciences, right? That that part of his argument against Clifford is the idea that that we operate with this scientific hard evidentialism or something to that effect. When James would say, and of course James is a scientist, he would say, no, we don't. And scientists who claim that they're doing this don't do it either. That all of our lives are a kind of resistance beyond what we're given by the limitations of reason. Maybe I should let you, that would be a final question.
One last thing I think I would say about this then is I think we have to be very, very careful about who is defining faith and what is defining faith. So Professor Lane suggested perhaps a Platonic faith. We have hinted at some Christian modalities of faith. I'll simply point out that within a Talmudic faith, all of the moral imperatives are negatively stated. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. They might say, love your Lord God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Cool. But then here's the cool term for Hashem there is the merciful one, the one who's distanced themselves from us. In its mercy has removed itself from the situation, such that in Bereshit 1, we have an account of creation through negativity, through the interruption of the totality of the nature of the divine, the resistance of its own totality, of the Ein Sof, the oneness of the totality of being, such that proliferations of things can emerge. So if we want to talk about faith, there's a very nice account of what is good to follow in the steps of Hashem. And how do you do that? By negating yourself at every step, removing yourself from the situation, allowing the other to precede you, to take the bread out of your own mouth to feed the other, as the prophets say. And this, now I'm getting very Talmudic. This is an act of resistance against my own nature, which says, take care of yourself first, feed yourself, eat. Letting my responsibility to the suffering created in the other, created by the nature of reality itself, to predominate my natural born instincts to feed and to survive and to live and go, hey, look, what's mine is mine. You got to take care of yourself. That's the way of nature. Yeah, it is. Nature's awful. I'm not gonna live that way. I'm having to have faith that somehow I might extract some good. There you go, faith. I know it won't. I got no evidence to believing I will, but I'm still going to do it. As for me and my house, we're going to serve Hashem. We're going to try to negate ourselves and negate our own natures.
Lovely conclusion. Thanks to everyone who's come. We do have the next meeting of the Socratic is on February the 21st, go to Gonzaga Socratic Club. Just do a search, you'll find it, and get more info. Thanks again to Drew Dalton for speaking to us from far away in Chicago. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.